Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guests today are
I'm Bruce Williams, and I teach media studies at the University of Virginia.
welcome, Bruce.
And I'm Michael Delli Carpini. I'm Professor Emeritus from the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania.
Well, great to be with you both, old friends, and you're actually veterans of the podcast
Yeah.
in that you've done this double act before, but now we're doing it in a different light or a different shade, and that is in the context of a certain general election that took place last November. You're both experts on public opinion, Monkey, perhaps, and on democracy. WTF, dudes, what happened and why? Because the Democratic Party is tearing itself apart over this, as is customary when you lose elections. But it feels to me as though the explanations that we got in the first 24 hours haven't really changed, despite there being new data available. So, what's going on?
Bruce, you want to jump in on this?
You want to go first, or
No,
so?
go ahead.
Um, so I think Toby, for all this is a difficult time to suss out, obviously, and you mentioned that it's been a while since the election, but I feel, and this is just totally subjective and, comes from just being around relatives and other people, is I feel like, yeah, it's been a while, but everyone is just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. This is an interregnum. I don't use
Mm.
that word. I don't think I've ever used that word, but and I think that it is a weird time because every day, if you follow the news, there's something more. But how to assess it in terms of what, Michael and I have been talking about for decades and what the future holds, uh, I don't know. And I think that some of this is because of how rapidly the changes that were already in process, things like, oh, I don't know, growing inequality, problems of race and sexual identity, immigration, all of those are our area of looking at media. All of those things were changing, and a lot of us, well, some of us had, kind of reasonable theories and predictions about what was going to happen. And then came Donald Trump and COVID. And I think that all of those processes got so sped up that the changes occurred much more rapidly than we're used to in the past. And then also there are the kind of original tensions and dramas that Trump himself and his acolytes now introduced to all of this. So, Michael, you want to make us sound more than just
No,
every.
I mean, I share what comes across in what you said, Bruce, is just how uncertain things are and uncertain we are as researchers and scholars as to how to make sense of this. But let me say a couple of things. What was surprising about this result and what was not so surprising? So the reality is that Donald Trump won in 2016 in a really close election. Joe Biden won in 2020 in a really close election. We all knew going into this election it was going to be close again. And I can honestly say that if I had to bet before the election had taken place, given not what I thought should happen or not what I thought hoped would happen, but what all the data, the survey results, the patterns and trends, I would have bet that Trump was going to win because after a brief honeymoon period when Kamala Harris was uh, brought to the fore in that very strange situation with Joe Biden sticking around and then dropping out, and there not being any process for who was going to take his place. Um, it really looked bad the last couple of weeks. If you just looked at the way things were going, um, and so it's not shocking that
Yeah.
he won, right? It's disappointing, and it speaks volumes, which we can talk about, Toby, about this dramatically split electorate we have right now, and what that means in a two-party system. And Bruce has some thoughts on this, I think. What surprised me is the degree to which Trump won, and what I mean by that is, the Electoral College, as your listeners may know, kind of distorts things. So it can be a very close race, but somebody can win a lot of the electoral votes because it's winner take all pretty much in every state. So that happens. But the fact that he took all seven of the battleground states, um, the fact that I think they're still trying to fine tune the final vote total, but the fact that he clearly won more votes than Kamala Harris did, which in the past is unusual. The Democrats, even when they lose presidential elections, usually win the majority of the votes cast. And that's why people don't like or some people don't like the Electoral College and how it distorts things. But Donald Trump got more votes than Kamala Harris did this time. And if you look at subgroups in the population, he got more votes from a large group of different types of constituents, and he did better than Biden did and better than he did in 2016 across almost every group, including groups that are strong supporters of the Democrats. And so for me, the thing I'm wrestling with since the election is not that Trump won, although I'm disappointed, I will say out loud that he won, but that he did as well as he did, especially among different groups that you wouldn't expect to be more attracted to him. Um, and we are now in a situation, it's hard to argue like you could in 2016 that people didn't know what they were voting for. Now, we can talk about the role of misinformation, which I think is important. It's the case that in a two-party system, uh, there's no one Trump voter, one type of voter, and there's no one Democratic voter. But this changes Donald Trump from potentially an aberration to one of the more significant presidents in American history, regardless of how this turns out. And that's what I'm struggling with is what does that say about American politics? And it's made me think harder about the history of American politics and realizing maybe this is less of an aberration in some ways than it seems like it is.
Yeah, so I want to not push back,
Yeah.
but I think that what I what I struggle with, and I mean, Michael and I, we both struggle. We talk on enough about this. Um, is what was this election? Because I think there is a very strong and probably intellectually legitimate reason for looking at this election the way we've looked at elections in the past. And, how different is this? What's changed? And that sort of thing. But there's another way of looking at it that this was not like other elections. This
Sure.
was a different kind of election. And if that's the case, going forward is going to be a lot different and less easy to predict than things were in the past. And what I mean by that is it's very clear that many, many Americans are really angry. And they're angry for different reasons, but I like to think and maybe this is right or not, that one of the primary ultimate sources of that unhappiness is the vast and growing economic inequality in this country. And the idea that now the system itself, the political system, I think, is seen by most people and a lot of us, I think, as being really not reflecting public opinion, people's interests, people's problems. That it's rather, in our system, in the end, you only have one of two choices. You can either vote for Democrats or Republicans. And in this election, if you were really unhappy with the state of American politics, the state of America as a society, where does that leave you? Do you vote for Kamala Harris, who, whatever else you can say, she didn't have the time or the inclination to really run as this change candidate? And if you were angry, who better to vote for than Donald Trump? And just one last thing, and then you guys can try and calm me down. But I think that that speaks to, in my opinion, the total dysfunction of the American political system. And by that, I mean, I don't see how almost anyone could look at the government in Washington as it has behaved over the last, pick a number, 20 years, 10, whatever, and say that political system is capable of solving the extraordinary problems that we face. And once you say that, and you have a lot of people or enough people shifting, so now Republicans have an outright majority of voters, we're in a new place. And I fear about the forces that are in the best position to take advantage of this moment.
One of the things that is going on in the context of this election and is really getting a lot of attention here in Europe is the argument that delivery no longer matters. That the idea that the efficient and effective operation of the machinery of government to implement programs based on policies that appear on their own and sometimes other terms to have succeeded, in fact, don't matter very much. And that narrative is what matters, right? I mean, you're probably both familiar with this argument. It's been becoming more and more popular in the United States in the last couple of years, and really it's become very important here too. And part of this argument is saying that when the technocrats in the Biden administration point to the stock market booming and unemployment being low and so on, what they fail to engage is that it doesn't feel like that for ordinary people. I mean, you've got to make people feel that they're getting something. Whereas my argument is that people are right to say they're not getting anything because these indices of delivery are actually completely useless in terms of the fair distribution of wealth. So I'd like your view on this argument about delivery and rationality being in the past and storytelling being the thing of the time, which I think is very demeaning actually to ordinary people.
So I would love to talk about that, Toby, because you put it much more clearly than it's been in my head, but I do think that's a big issue. And Bruce and I, again, have kind of gone back and forth on this particular topic when we talk to each other. So if you look at really good research, there's no question that working class and middle class folks do better on almost every indicator when the Democrats are in office. When you look at what some of the groups that have voted for Donald Trump, it's pretty hard to argue legitimately that they are people that Donald Trump is going to actually help. And so this notion that, and yet they voted for him anyways. And so this notion that well, maybe it doesn't matter what's actually happening. The point that you made, it's a pretty compelling one at one level, but I also share your feeling. Yes, it's true that working class folks do better under democratic rule, but better is a relative term. And if you look at how well, in a broader sense, working class, poor people, middle class people have done, how groups like women and African Americans and other minority groups have done, they're not doing so well. I mean, they're not doing so well. You know, in relative terms, maybe there's some evidence that they've caught up a little bit, but in reality, the pace of change, given how well the top 10, 5, 1% is doing, is really undramatic. And so I share your feeling that there could be another reckoning coming. I mean, you didn't say that, but to my mind, if Donald Trump and the Republicans do not deliver in any meaningful way for the many groups that voted for him, short of the cultural issues where they might be able to show that, they're paying a little less attention to woke issues, even though we could talk about that because I think that's a misnomer for what the Democrats have done. I think tangible material conditions ultimately matter. And what the next reckoning would look like, given that the Democrats don't have their act together to address these issues, and I suspect the Republicans will disappoint. I don't know how long that will take, and I think the kind of smoke and mirrors of a good narrative um, will work for a while. But I don't. I agree with you that I think that's a demeaning argument, and I agree with you. What I think you were suggesting, that in the long run, material conditions actually matter.
I want to, so I think you put it in a way, Michael, that I think captures my dilemma at the moment,
Yep.
because everything you say is consistent with what we know about American politics. And, going back to Walter Lippmann, who I've been rereading depressingly a lot, you vote if you're feeling better than you were at the last election, you vote for incumbents. If not, you vote for the out party. But there's another way of looking at this, and maybe it's because of the times I have been rereading. I'm about two-thirds of the way through The Origins of Totalitarianism by Arendt. And also I read a while ago the book Strong Men by, I'm blanking on her name. But the point here is that if we really have a kind of a movement away from democracy and politics as we used to know it to a more authoritarian kind of government, I think that models like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy become really important. But beyond that, I think that, to go back to this question of the delivery, whether the delivery matches the rhetoric, one of the features of an authoritarian leader, and Trump and his core followers are a perfect example of that. It is that, first of all, he has identified enemies, and enemies are to blame. And in an authoritarian system, the committed followers, they're not playing the game of democracy the way, it has been played. What they're doing is they don't believe in American democracy. They don't believe in the Constitution. They believe in Donald Trump right now. And I think what that means is that there are ways of explaining away the pain that folks might feel over, and I think it's a 2-year period until the midterm elections where there might be another kind of reckoning. But two things I think are really important. One is that this has happened before. And I think that saying that Donald Trump is going to be in office, and then because the economy or immigration is not fixed in 2 years, we're going to have a swing back to the Democrats. That depends a lot on how the Trump administration behaves. And the last thing that worries me, and this is the media part of it, you know, how many decades did we spend, talking about the media monopoly and the dangers of concentration of media and all of that stuff from Bagdikian and folks like that that I taught for decades. But now we have a kind of media concentration that is much different than it was in the past. First, these are much bigger corporations than the media corporations we're used to. And take a look at Elon Musk. And what do we think about him? Because the last thing I'll add, and Toby, you brought it up when you talked about how folks, how Europeans are reacting to the American elections. American elections are international events right now. And so the relationship between, Musk saying he supports AfD in Germany or paying money to get the Labour Party out of power in England, as media scholars, what do we say about someone like Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, who now has, at least at the moment, seems like have extraordinary political power and a platform that he has shown a real willingness to use for simply his own purposes with no accountability?
So, if I could, first of all, I agree with a lot of what you said, Bruce. I want to clarify one thing about what I said. When I say that material conditions matter, and if Trump doesn't come up with the goods at some point, and the Republicans don't improve those conditions, there'll be a reckoning. I'm not talking about a swing back to the Democrats. I'm
Yeah,
talking
okay, yeah.
about a 8 or 12 year period where it has become clear that neither of the two parties that control politics and the groups that control those parties are able to address the issues that really matter to people effectively. I'm not suggesting, now business as usual would be Democrats do well in the off year election and maybe Democrats win in 2000 and what would it be, 2028. Um, I'm not suggesting that's what I see, though that could be what happens. What I'm suggesting is that we have now had a long enough period with really existential issues from immigration to wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East to, I think, centrally, as you said, economic inequality at levels we haven't seen possibly at all in the United States, to social issues, to civil rights issues like abortion and health issues. I think neither that the outcome of a failure on the part of Trump to make material conditions better is is a failure of the party system and American democracy more general. And I don't know what that looks like, but I don't think it's simply a return to the Democratic Party.
So just to reinforce that, because we both unsurprisingly, I think, agree on most of that. But so I saw, I think today or yesterday, a suggestion that came from Timothy Snyder, the on tyranny, scholar. And one of the things he suggested, and it made so much sense to me, he said that it was really important that the Democratic Party have a a cabinet right now, like they have in English politics, or because the idea behind that is if you had a Democratic shadow Secretary of Defense or shadow, head of Food and Drug Administration, there would be a way of every time something happened that in the Trump administration, there would not just be the usual, hair pulling and pearl clutching of the usual suspects. There would be someone that the press would have to go to and say, here's what, we would do. And that made so much sense to me, and it seemed so important. But if you take even half a step back, what are the chances that the Democratic Party could reach a decision that is that far reaching in a sense, because it's never happened before, but is necessary now? And so I wonder if the Democratic Party is going to be able to really play the role of an opposition party.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, and then just the second thing well, never mind. Yeah, I'll
Just
just
on
leave
that
it.
point, one of the difficulties, of course, is that in the system of shadow cabinets, you're going to have the two opponents, as it were, both in Parliament, where the opposition spokesperson on foreign policy can ask the Secretary of Foreign Policy a question about X, Y, or Z, or ask the Prime Minister that. This is more complicated because it's always mediated more clearly in the US case. And would the Democrats set up a system whereby they had all these people who were probably selected by the Democratic National Committee what would be the mechanism for doing it, and how would that play out
and
amongst
what
the
would be the message of that shadow um, uh, cabinet? Is it going to be, here's what Trump is doing wrong, and elect the Democrats, and we'll go back to doing what we did? Is it going to make more what I think are necessary fundamental issues raised? I mean, fundamental that ain't even that dramatic, but the idea that something has to be done about economic inequality. What is the Democrat stance right now on addressing what, right from the founding of the American Republic, was always seen as a necessary component, which is a relatively flat, not flat, but a less extreme economic system, and that democracies need that, I think, to be democracies, and that requires at least things like a 1%. I mean, I'm using this as an example because I'm not an economist, but a 1 or 2% tax on wealth. Um, that could make a dramatic difference. I mean, and not dramatic in a let's have a revolution style, dramatic in let's stick with the basic operation of a liberal democracy, but let's try to get things under control a little bit more. I don't see any evidence that, in fact, the evidence seems to. You had mentioned at the beginning, Toby, that the Democratic Party seems in disarray. One of the things that worries me, of the many things that worry me, is that the message the Democrats are getting is we've got to look a little bit more like the Republicans. And that's a model you could speak to this maybe, Bruce, because we talked about the kind of Downsian model and how a two-party system is supposed to work, where the idea is public opinion is kind of the bulk of it is in the middle, and if the parties go too far to the extremes, even if they're good issues, there's a pressure to move towards the middle on both sides, and that's how, even if you only have two parties, you don't get maybe you suffer to the extent that you can have major change easily and in quick fashion. But the upside of it is if a Democrat or a Republican wins, the difference is real, but it's not so dramatic that you can't move forward as a nation in certain kind of ways. We now have a two-party system with incredibly close elections, the longest stretch of close elections that we've ever had in our history, with at least a government body of and to some extent, not full extent, but to some extent, a public set of opinions that are bifurcated, and so that razor thin differences in who wins and who loses can lead to dramatic differences in the direction that the country goes in. That's a really problematic situation to be in, I think.
So I mean, there are some really wonderful political scientists. I think they're at UCLA, and they have done a lot of work on what they call the calcification of American politics. And part of what happens is, there are several 100,000 voters that are the least engaged, they're the least involved in politics. They come to the election late, and they are up for grabs in ways that a lot of other voters are not. So, they might vote for Obama twice and then Trump, and then they might vote for Biden. But the problem there is those persuadable 100,000 voters, given different circumstances, like you're saying, they can send the political system off in dramatically different directions. But here's, in thinking about this, I think that one of the reasons that I am more pessimistic and alarmed, I think, than maybe you are, Michael, and it's just we take sides in these, but I think about climate change. For me, that is the ultimate, like, reality, fact, science, nature, whatever is pushing back. You want to talk about deliverables, you want to talk about stuff that is really going to challenge the power of narratives. Think about the reality of climate change. But what I think that indicates is another thing that is central to American politics is the idea of growth. American politics, for a very long time, given the ideas about the frontier and going west and all of this to the 20th century, to the 21st century, the idea is we need growth because it's only with growth that you can keep everyone, you can give everyone at least what they got last year, and have a little bit extra to address the problems of redistribution or whatever. And I think that underneath a lot of the tensions in democratic politics, I think around the world, is the recognition we don't live in an era of growth anymore. I think that the idea that we have extraordinary inequality in income is the reason that's such a problem now is because there is very little upward mobility. There is very little chance of really, moving into that wealth category. And once you say that, okay, if we're going to solve this problem, we're going to have to take money away from that group.
Yeah.
That's a different kind of politics. And that is a politics that it's unclear to me is in any way capable of addressing these issues. And in that circumstance, and I don't know how far I want to go with this, but is democracy a better political system for addressing the global challenges we have than an enlightened authoritarianism? And I think that's a horrible question to ask, but I think it's a question for me now.
I guess one of the issues there is the fact that this religion of growth, which is pretty universal, unfortunately, in terms of democracies, but other political forms as well, isn't compatible with combating climate change. And it isn't compatible with diminishing the mistreatment of hundreds of millions of people around the world every year in material terms. So that notion, Bruce, you put it so well, of at least you get the same as you got last year with a little bit of icing as well, as the bare minimum. That may not be sustainable unless there is a serious redistribution of wealth within and across territories, unless there is something done about the legacy of colonialism, and unless climate change is treated much more seriously than it has been. All those things have to occur, it seems to me. And this question, when you say enlightened authoritarianism, obviously that sends shivers down my spine, and
Mine too, Toby.
maybe yours, and maybe Michael's, and maybe listeners. But at some level, that is what Trump is offering his people, isn't it? Actually.
Oh, I think that's right. I think that is what vote for me and you'll never have to vote again, he said. There's no question that that's what he's doing. And part of my, or big part of my disagreement with that is that his version of an enlightened world is not a world that I consider enlightened. But if he were pushing for economic redistribution and radically addressing the environment and uh, uh, rationalizing a policy of immigration and making sure that women's rights are protected and treated equally, but doing it and saying, vote for me and you'll never have a vote again. I still think, because I'm a small d Democrat to the core, that I would have problems with that, but it would be it would be a different set of problems. And
So,
so, yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
yeah, so I think that in terms of my personal self-interest, yeah, I have problems with that. But, and what I would say is, after the election, the Democratic politician that I've listened to again and again, and I think he's the only Democratic politician that is speaking what I think is sense, is Bernie Sanders. And so let's make, in your example, what would we think about a Democrat? So if we're in a situation where, as per usual, people like you and me run around with our hair on fire, like everything is the end of the world, and we're just going to have, this is going to be a realignment, let's say, and that's one way of looking at it. But on the other hand, if we take seriously this idea that democratic politics are really being challenged in some kind of fundamental way, is the solution a democratic Donald Trump, a democratic authoritarian? And I don't know what that would be like, where that would come from, and I'm certainly not comfortable with it. But if you're talking about voters who are really unhappy about feeling screwed by elites like you and me, Michael, you know, I wonder what that appeal would be. And so, yeah,
I mean, I'll just say one thing because we've walked pretty far down this path now.
yeah, we should back up. Yeah.
That I also, one of the reasons why I think benevolent dictatorships, or small democratic authoritarianism, or whatever word you want to use for it, doesn't work, is that I still believe that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Give me an example of such a person or such a regime. I do think
Oh,
that
I have one.
wait, but hold on just a second. I do think the
Yeah.
value of democracy is not just the kind of normative value that everyone should have an equal right in a say about how goods and services and values are allocated, but that giving power to a single person or a single small group seldom produces
Yeah.
results that are to the benefit of everybody. But you said you had an example, so
Yeah. Um, Paul Kagame in Rwanda.
okay, so I know not enough
I
to
have
even respond.
followed because I'm there several years ago. He is the leader of the guerrilla forces that, came in after the genocide in 1994. He is an authoritarian. I mean, he's been in power since then. He is not a nice person. He does people he's unhappy with. He does awful things, but he's put that country back together again. And Rwanda, compared to countries in sub-Saharan Africa around it, is kind of a model because it has the lowest levels of corruption in that region. It is now there's a lot of foreign investment, and, and but every year, and this is just to support your point, Michael, every year he does things that make you think, well, where is the end of this trade-off? And and the issue is not whether I prefer democracy to authoritarianism. I mean, of course but is that still on the table? Because something you said really struck a bell with me. You said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. To me, that describes Chuck Schumer, that describes the leadership of both parties, but here the Democratic Party, and that's one of the reasons that I think it's hard to look to that party for solutions when even a little tiny thing that they could have done, like elect AOC to the head of that, and they couldn't even do that.
Yeah, I'm not I agree that the question, one of the questions that's on the table, Toby, I'd love to hear what you think about this, is democracy up to the task? I mean, there are times when I think, given the path as a nation and as a globe we've gone down, that we may have come to a point where the problems that we face are not resolvable. I mean, that's an overstatement to a certain extent, but certainly the question of is democracy up to the task of creating a good life for people under the auspices of the way democracy works. But I think there's a prior question or a related question, and that is, before we can even begin to answer that question, we have to stop and say, so how democratic are we? Is the issue that that democracy doesn't work, or is the question the issue that we haven't tested democracy
Yeah,
because
we would have to try it
yeah, we'd have to
first.
try it first. And so again, that's an overstatement to a degree, especially in the moment that we're in right now, where it's really, where you find yourself thinking about these issues in a broader context. But I do think we're in a profound. There's no question. I don't think that we're in a profound moment. And at some point, Toby, it would be good maybe to just address the more simple explanations for this election, because those are the ones. I think when you started, you said, the Democratic Party seems as if it's in disarray. There, there is kind of the more mainstream, I'll call it, or simple explanation. When you have a close election, there are a dozen things that could have been different, that may have changed the result, and maybe Harris would have won by 250,000 votes rather than losing by a collective 250,000 votes. I don't think that would have solved. I think part of the point that Bruce is making, I think, is that would not have solved the problem, right? The bigger underlying problems that we have. It would address some of the scarier issues that we have with what Trump and his administration may be capable of, but it would not have addressed the underlying material conditions that you were talking about, Toby, that people are in. People might have been a little bit better off. Maybe there'd be a federal law that protects abortion rights, but the larger economic inequality and concerns about the future of the globe and international crises and the fact that it's not just an issue of immigration policy for the United States, but why are people needing to immigrate from areas that are in desperate situations? Those problems aren't going to be solved by the Democratic Party as it's currently constituted either, I don't think.
So I just want to, from reading Arendt again, one of the things that she talks about, and I think it's true because I think the real absence here is some kind of effective global order. you know, the kind of institution that the United Nations was supposed to be when it was imagined at the end of World War II. The kind of, it would have the authority and power to really discipline nation states. And one of the things that Arendt points out that was going on in the rise of fascism was the conflict between the idea of universal human rights and nationalism. And I think that the solutions to the environmental issue, I think for them to be compelling internet, that there has to be a more robust belief in the universality of human rights, and to be right, what may be a little optimistic. So, I think what we need are examples from the past that are compelling of international cooperation that was forged in a way that required nations to make short-run sacrifices, to form coalitions that they weren't willing to form before, because there is this existential crisis. And just because, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I've been looking at the way, for example, the Second World War is remembered, and it's remembered mostly around the world as a series of individual national heroisms. It's what did your nation do? And what's missing is the idea that you had this extraordinary alliance across communism and capitalism, democracy and authoritarianism, anti-colonialism and pro-colonial nations were able to form an alliance over those disagreements because there was a recognition that there was a greater threat of, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And what I am really looking for are how to create those kinds of compelling narratives. And, as media studies scholars, and, I think immediately, well, that's all great to think about it, but we don't even have a media system that would be capable of that. I mean, I think and that's another piece of why it is so difficult to address in any meaningful way climate change, which the longer it goes unaddressed, it increases all the stuff that you were mentioning, Toby, about, the real material conditions of people's lives. They're affected every year. So I don't see
Looking
where the
back at
international.
what we might think of as successes of the UN, some of which were inherited from the League, of course, they're in areas that could be deemed fairly technical. So I'm thinking of, at least in certain ways, the International Telecommunications Union, the old International Postal Union, some elements of the World Health Organization, though we've seen how politicized that can be. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, albeit academic, is operating under the rubric of governments, and it functions very effectively, I think, and not necessarily in terms of being able to influence governmental policy, but it does a lot and it gets a lot of attention. And if you look at media coverage of climate change, it tends to, in many countries, to circle or cycle rather, around about the same time as when there are conferences of the parties and around the same time as when there are new and well-publicized IPCC reports. So I guess one of the things that I think needs to happen is an expose of the monumental international think tank connections, loosely connected under the Atlas Group moniker, mostly in the United States, mostly funded in the United States, but immensely efficacious in Western, Eastern, and Central Europe, that spread lies about almost everything, but that continue to be cited as authorities by the bourgeois media. And it seems to me that that battle for ideas has deeply politicized climate change in the interests of international capital and big military states, away from allowing it to be a relatively technical discussion, but one that is not hard to explain to ordinary readers. So I think this is a genuinely a sort of ideational problem, actually. It's an
So,
ideology thing.
I mean, one of the things that I thought was insane about the last campaign is that, for everything else, the Biden administration passed, calling it the Inflation Reduction Act, but that was recognized by the international, climate change community as the most significant climate legislation passed in any country for the last 30 years. And and I think this question of narratives and ideation, the Democratic Party was in a position where they couldn't even talk about that, because to say that's what a problem they were trying to solve would cost them voters who only wanted to know whether they were going to pay $2.50 again for gasoline. And to me, where is that narrative to say, you know, there is a reason all of this is happening, that we need to do things now. And there's a term that I think could use a lot of kind of wordsmithing and publicity is, think about what the word appeasement, how that carries weight in international relations down to today. Well, we've appeased the climate. I mean, 20 years ago, had we done anything, just the littlest things, we wouldn't be in this position now. And I think, and I struggle for how to revive the power of a term like appeasement and apply it in this different context. Because then you get to look at the rise of the right, a lot of things differently. But I don't, I wish there was some place that kind of thing was coming from. I don't.
Well, guys, we need to wrap it up in the next couple of minutes. I think I've got two suggestions. One is that each of you have a minute or two to add anything you want or subtract anything. But secondly, I think it would be great if we reconvened in the new year, and you might want to invite a couple of others as well, to talk about Michael's question of democracy and whether it's fit for purpose, and Bruce's championing of Rwanda.
Oh, okay. So I would hate to achieve any kind of, finally recognition for being, yeah, he's the guy that really wanted a dictator.
No, point taken, but seriously, to talk in these
Yeah.
both theoretical and conceptual, but also practical material terms about democracy. And I think that also gets to the heart of things like revising constitutions,
Yeah.
which we've
Yeah.
seen happen in many countries in the last 20 or 30 years, but not in a couple of quite important ones we could mention. So I'd
Yeah.
like.
Thank you, Toby, and I love the podcast. I should say that, and I've listened to a number of your different interviews. Yeah, I mean, the thing I want to say is that I think the extent to which what happened was unfortunate if you're on the left, but could have been addressed by a better campaign or a better candidate, or if Biden had stepped down early, or if a few people had voted a little differently, or if the Democrats had a strategy for getting out the vote that was as effective as the Republicans turned out to be by aiming at the kind of voter that Bruce talked about, that's either hardly ever votes or votes occasionally, or some more existential moment that we're facing. I think we're going to begin to know the answer to that pretty quickly in the new administration. I think number one, Trump and the Republicans are more prepared this time and more experienced this time in ways that are kind of scary in some ways, but they are more. They're going to hit the ground running more. They're more aware that they've only got 2 years to be sure of, maybe even only 18 months once the campaign starts. And they've made a lot of promises that I think are more than empty promises now about how they're going to deal with immigration, about how they're going to deal with international affairs. And some of these issues are, you've got the environment, which is the big monster in the background, but you've got some things like the Middle East, Ukraine, and immigration where they can be doing things, where things need to happen pretty quickly. And so I think every indication, once the election was over, I approached this by thinking, um, oh my God, this is what America wants. This is what America's going to get. Let's see if they can do anything. Let's see if the Republican Party can actually be the party of the working class. I had a moment where I thought that. When you look at what already is being done in terms of who's being appointed to the various administrative posts, or at least being nominated, this looks like it's going to be ugly. But we'll see what happens, and I think we'll see pretty quickly. So that's the point I wanted to add.
Bruce?
So, yeah, I don't want to add to the ranting and raving that I've done before about the need for dictatorship, but I think that 15 years ago, it probably is, or 12 years ago, I had a long conversation on the phone with Bob McChesney. And I remember where I was, like I was on my porch walking back and forth. And Bob's idea at that point was that he wanted to lead an effort to take over the Republican Party at that moment. Because he said, this is a party, this was after Obama's election. This is a party wandering in the wilderness, and this is a time for progressives and to really take over the party, take ownership. And Bob and we had the wildest it was a great, fun conversation. But Trump kind of did that, didn't he? He took over a party. And I think that we're living with that. And the last thing I want to say is, so I agree with what Michael said, except that I think that idea of this election expressing what Americans wanted, I think that's wrong. I think that a lot of people are pissed off and angry and they want something done. And so they voted for the guy who was saying, I'm going to burn it all down. I'm going to be your retribution. Now, when he doesn't deliver on that, what the consequences are, that's a different kind of question. But going back, I think when you only have two parties, there are lots of ways of interpreting what people wanted and why they voted the way they did.
Well, Bruce Williams, Michael Delli Carpini, thank you both very, very much. It's been a terrifically instructive conversation. I've learned a lot. It gives me something to think about, a lot to think about. And as I said, I really want you to reconvene, and sure, we can talk about, I mean, really, the gang that couldn't pour a glass of milk straight once they get into power, but also about these foundational issues of democracy. That would be wonderful.
To be continued, Toby. Thanks a lot.
Lovely. Thank you.